Good afternoon, friends. I'm Homi Bhabha. I direct the Mahindra Humanities Center, and I'm delighted to welcome our speakers, whose eminence is plainly visible in the programs we've given you. So we will keep our introductions brief so that their interventions can be a little longer than their introductions. And it's really a pleasure to see so many people here of a rainy Monday afternoon. So thank you for braving the elements. Welcome to our conference on asymmetric warfare. I want to thank our speakers, and I also want very much to thank those not mentioned in the program. Sarah Razor and Suzanne Smith, whose logistical skills are now very well known. They put together these amazing programs. Suzanne represents the Mellon seminar for us and organizes the various activities related to the seminar, and Sarah does everything to bring us all together on the many occasions on which we meet. So thank you, Sarah, thank you, Suzanne. And my gratitude is always to Stephen Beale, my colleague at the center, who is as genial as he is brilliant in managing to hold things together that I can never sort of get to hold together, and in bringing things together. So thank you, Steve. Where are you? There. Thanks a lot. This is the second of our two spring conferences associated with the Mahindra Humanities Center's Mellon Seminar on Violence, Nonviolence. Last month, we hosted The Great War at 100, an inquiry into the historical causes, poetic aspects, and political outcomes of the First World War. In the century that separates the Great War from us, we have experienced a series of wars and conflicts that make this conference particularly timely. No war is ever symmetric in intention or execution. And linear, progressive narratives of wars, causes, and consequences, beloved by politicians and the media, rarely take into account the asynchronic engagements that fuel warfare, the trauma of memories, tattered scraps of leftover history that atavistically emerge, territories conquered and yet unfailingly contested, wounds open, festered, and uncovered. Wars rarely seem to be contained by their contemporary spaces of engagement, and they frequently manage to exceed the time limit of their execution. The uncontainable wrath of war, the collateral damage that is inevitable and incalculable, gives the discussion of asymmetric warfare an urgency for our times. And it is because we refuse to say, shit happens, in the style of Donald Rumsfeld, that we convene you here today to discuss asymmetry and warfare, strategies, ethics, narrative, and law. The idea for such a discussion emerged for me in the wake of the controversial 2009 UN report on human rights in Palestine and other occupied Arab territories, also known as the Goldstone Report. Although he's sitting in front of me here quite unaware of his originating role in inspiring this conference, it was Moshe Halbertal, happily with us here today, who sowed the seed when, in a casual conversation with me, he said that the conceptual frame of the report was in some ways fraught because it did not take into account the conventions of asymmetric warfare, the unconventional conventions of asymmetric warfare. Moshe's comments stayed with me, and in the process of planning the Mellon seminar, I called upon my friend and colleague Noah Feldman, well known for his off-the-cuff, vivacious brilliance, and that's a comment on your clothes as well as, but not only, to help us to define our intentions and objectives. I want to thank Noah and acknowledge his great friendship to the interdisciplinary, cross-campus aspirations of the Mahindra Center. He's always been there for us, and I hope he will continue to be. Thank you. What better way of doing this than sharing with you a line or two from his concept note to me? To the strategist, Noah said, of asymmetric warfare, both objectives and capacities are dynamic rather than static. To the ethical theorist of war, asymmetry poses difficult questions relating to both jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Once a state of war exists, what moral and ethical principles apply to engagement with an enemy whose capacities of objectives are asymmetrical? What counts as proportionality in asymmetric conflict? Now, when faced with questions that are as acute and unyielding as these, I usually turn to the poet W.H. Auden. Very early on, we decided that the specifics of our interests this afternoon in legal and political configurations of asymmetric war should not shield us from grappling with the larger concept of asymmetry, its figurative and phenomenal forms. And in that spirit, I want to end with some verses from Auden. Oh, how the devil who controls the moral asymmetric souls, the either-ors, the mongrel halves who find truth in a mirror, laughs. The public space where acts are done in theory common to us all, the agora of work and news where each one has the right to choose, the other is the inner space of private ownership, the place that each of us is forced to own, like his own life from which it's grown. The oracular poet, like the Freudian joker, opens up a third space of enunciation and contestation to unsettle the appealing alignments of divided subjects and polarized conditions. There is something more than the binarism of those conditions. It is by creating a third discourse of mimetic recognition and representation, truth in the mirror, that the poet reveals the asymmetry and anxiety invested in deciding where and whether it is possible to draw the line between the obligations of the public voice and the interests of the private wish. For us asymmetric souls, there is no legal or moral redemption. There is only iteration and negotiation, and perhaps a form of accommodation. We find ourselves split, if that is possible, in a triangulation of desire. At one moment confronted by the imperatives of the public predicament, at another moment compelled by the drives and demands of private life, and then, in a third dimension, moving restlessly in the mediatory mongrel condition in between that Auden calls the public space of commonality and the inner space of private ownership, keeping, if we can, both eros and agape in play. Thank you for being here today, and I'd now like to turn over to my friend and colleague, Noah, who will chair our first panel. Noah, thank you.
Thank you, Homi, so much for that wonderfully kind, generous, and deeply thought-provoking introduction. It's always the most difficult person in the entire university, and I don't want to say anywhere in the world, to follow to a podium is Homi. I thought I would try, though, with an epigram of my own. It's not from Auden, but it's from the Deuteronomist quoting not yet King David, the small boy David, at his moment of entrance onto the public stage when he's facing Goliath, the champion of the Philistines. And as he approaches, as we all know, carrying his staff and some small stones in his slingshot, Goliath says to him, "Am I a dog that you come to me with a staff?" And David responds, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, and I come to you in the name of the Lord God of hosts." That's a pretty good epigram, I think, on asymmetry, because it captures, first, the background assumption that in the single-hand combat that's been appointed to decide the war between the Philistines and the Israelites in this scenario, David approaches asymmetrically. He's small, Goliath is large, and as we know, he has up his sleeve the asymmetry of a technique of warfare, namely the stones that he's about to use in the slingshot. But of course, when he tells Goliath that in fact their conflict is asymmetric, he doesn't refer to the tool that he has. He refers to the much bigger authority figure, the big gun, as it were, that he claims to have behind him in his retinue. Our goal today will be, in this panel, to try to deepen discussions of asymmetry and warfare that are already known and familiar to us from the realms of strategic studies, from the realms of ethics, from the realm of law, and from the realm of political theory, and advance them into a sphere that takes on board humanistic discourse. And to achieve that goal, I truly cannot imagine a more extraordinary panel of people. This is, for me, a dream panel of three influential, creative, and above all, outside-the-box thinkers. You have their biographies, as Homi said, in your programs, but I just want to say, with reference to each of them, that Andrew Bacevich, sitting to my left, has been a central leading voice in the United States on the interface between international and diplomatic history and strategy, writing both about our past and very profoundly about Vietnam, and also about our present and the recent wars from which the United States has not yet fully emerged. He is somebody who is ideally placed to help humanists like us understand strategy, but he's somebody who's also already often doing the holy work of bringing a richer and broader perspective into the realm of strategic studies. Next speaking will be Moshe Halbertal. We're following alphabetical order today. Moshe Halbertal not only inspired the conference for Homi, but for some of us, you could say that Moshe inspired most of our academic careers. That's certainly true for me. He has thought profoundly about the relationship between ethical tradition and political tradition and real-world power politics, and that's involved him not only in the history of religion and the history of thought and the history of ideas, but also in a practical, immediate, and personal way. Moshe has acted as an advisor to the Israeli military on a wide range of ethical questions, and so he brings a practical perspective of ethics alongside his deep historical and humanistic learning. Elaine Scarry, sitting immediately to my right, has been among the most influential voices really anywhere in the world in thinking about violence and its relationship to the human person. Her work has focused very deeply on that subject, but in a range of different ways and from a range of different angles and perspectives. Her most recent work focuses precisely on the question of asymmetry, specifically asymmetry in the context of nuclear weapons. She's also written about asymmetry in the conventional context, and I cannot imagine a person in the humanities better positioned to help us explore these issues than Elaine. So I'm grateful to all of you for coming. I'm grateful to all of you for participating on the panel. I'm grateful to Homi and Steve and their team for putting this together. And I'm now going to turn the floor over first to Andrew. Each speaker will speak for approximately 15 to 20 minutes. Then we'll have a conversation here, and then we'll open it up to a general conversation involving all of you. Okay, Andrew, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation. Thanks very much for including me in this event. I don't even think I'll speak for 15 minutes. Let me begin by saying that, at least from a practitioner's point of view, I do not find the concept of asymmetric warfare to be especially useful. In a sense, we've already had a couple of allusions to this already, in a sense, all wars feature asymmetries, even those in which the belligerents manifest notable similarities. So I didn't attend the conference on World War I, but I imagine at some point people reflected a little bit on the stalemate that was such a central feature of war on the Western Front. And that stalemate derived certainly from many factors, but it lasted as long as it did due to the similar capabilities of the Allied armies on the one hand and the German army on the other hand. But from start to finish, the war on the Western Front, the war on the Western Front amounted to a frantic search for asymmetries that would confer a decisive advantage on one side over the other and therefore break the stalemate. The Germans sought that advantage chiefly through tactical innovation, which culminated in the spring 1917 offensive with its introduction of infiltration tactics employed by specially trained Sturmtruppen. In other words, the Germans, at least in the land war, pursued asymmetries of method. The Allies, on the other hand, emphasized technology, hoping that aviation and mechanized vehicles, tanks, might provide an edge for which the Germans would have no response. In other words, at least as far as the land war was concerned, the Allies pursued mechanical asymmetries. Yet the asymmetry that ultimately mattered most was actually the one that formed the very foundation of British power. That is to say, a superior navy that controlled the seas and enabled Great Britain to deprive Germany of the wherewithal to continue the war. Of course, the Germans, for their part, had attempted to counter that asymmetry by creating an innovative asymmetrical riposte of their own, namely undersea warfare used to impose a counter blockade. But that effort fell short. So at sea, the British pursued asymmetries of method, whereas the Germans pursued asymmetries of a mechanical notion, and the Brits came out on top. Now, to my knowledge, the belligerents of 1914-1918 did not use the term asymmetrical to describe what they were doing. And it's not clear to me that the introduction of this bit of jargon would have appreciably clarified the problem that they were wrestling with. It was just a particularly awful war. In our day, strategic analysts who have glommed onto the term have likewise, in my judgment, done little to clarify the problems that we face in the realm of national security. Plain language facilitates clarity of thought. Jargon serves mostly to obfuscate. And the term asymmetric warfare, at least in the realm of practitioners, is jargon at its worst. What it really means is war against adversaries who find it inconvenient to play by our rules and therefore opt to play by rules of their own. This concept, this use of asymmetric warfare, is an outgrowth of deeply defective thinking about the nature of warfare triggered by the end of the Cold War. Asymmetric warfare is the phrase that the national security apparatus invented to avoid acknowledging the full extent of those defects. The decade following the Cold War was the heyday of something called the Revolution in Military Affairs, or RMA. Now, the RMA was a civilian creation. Its godfather was somebody by the name of Andrew Marshall, longtime director of the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment. But before too long, senior military officers who fancied themselves advanced thinkers also climbed on board the RMA bandwagon. The essence of the RMA reduced to this claim that advanced information technology was transforming the very nature of warfare. Forces optimized to take advantage of such technology, they believed, would acquire advantages making them all but unstoppable. The RMA, therefore, offered the prospect of permanent military supremacy. And once achieved, that supremacy, proponents believed, would actually avert war, since challenging an unchallengeable foe would represent the height of folly. Best of all, in the view of RMA proponents, the United States of America was uniquely positioned to exploit the RMA to the fullest. This describes a set of ideas and debates that was ongoing during the 1990s. The RMA, in effect, posited a form of asymmetric warfare, though no one called it that, rooted in the expectations that superior technology in the form of precision-guided munitions, stealth aircraft, drones, high-speed communications, and the like conferred decisive advantages on the side that possessed them. Now, in actual practice, the RMA concept worked some of the time and didn't work the rest of the time. But the ultimate test came in 2003 when the U.S. invaded Iraq with its display of shock and awe. Now, you will recall that the invaders made very short work of the old and slow and distinctively non-RMA army of Iraq, and indeed, we quickly overthrew Saddam Hussein. But U.S. forces designed in accordance with RMA precepts and adhering to an RMA mindset proved unable to pacify the country that the United States now owned and occupied. Those resisting U.S. occupation were not cowed by presumed American military superiority, and the result was anarchy and an epic failure by a military force reputed to be unstoppable. Now, American analysts characterized the ensuing mess in Iraq as an example of asymmetric warfare, as if the United States were facing some sort of novel problem there. In fact, the unfolding of the Iraq War across the several years that followed the ouster of Saddam adhered to a very familiar script. It's what happens when an imperial presence triggers popular resistance. Falling back on pseudo-sophisticated explanations like asymmetric warfare makes it difficult to take on board some pretty obvious lessons that Americans really ought to take from their experience in Iraq with regard to the utility of military power. The first of those lessons, in my judgment, is to acknowledge that the nature of war is fixed. It can't be changed or simplified or reduced to some sort of formula. The RMA was a fraud. Any approach to waging war can be defeated by finding the appropriate asymmetries, even without bothering to use that term. The second lesson derives from the first. Given that reliance on a particular way of war invites adversaries to seek a workaround, to say that you believe in the RMA is to invite people to discover the counter to the RMA, any nation like the United States today that looks to military power as its preferred instrument had better cultivate a very broad repertoire of capabilities in order to respond to a very wide variety of possible contingencies. Real military supremacy, if plausible, and I don't think it is, but real military supremacy, if plausible, will require expenditures and exertions far beyond those that Americans seem inclined to make. And if we're not willing to undertake those efforts and expenditures, then perhaps it's time to rethink the emphasis that the United States places on possessing and using military might, which just might be the most important lesson of all. Thank you very much.
Moshe.
Okay, thank you very much, Noah and Homi, for inviting me to address these issues. And I want to start actually with a point that Andrew made and go from there. The concept of asymmetry itself needs clarification, and there are three possible explanations or three possible renderings of asymmetry. I'm going to address only one of them, because I think it is relevant. The one is to say that asymmetry means asymmetry of power between the two players, that one is overwhelmingly more powerful. It could change, it could be dynamic, but there is asymmetry of power. The other asymmetry is which is referred in the literature, is to say that there is asymmetry between state agents and non-state agents. So, for example, the war against Al-Qaeda is asymmetrical. There is a party backed by a state, by the collective power of a state against a non-state agent. I want to refer to another sense of asymmetry. I mean, we can call it different names. It's not important. But I think it has immense moral and legal implications. And my sense of asymmetry is the following. It comes from the fact that one party in the struggle wants to eliminate two classic features of war, which is uniform and front. I mean, the classic features, it's not historically all the time like that, is that wars are fought by two distinct entities, distinguishing themselves from their civilian environment by wearing uniform, clashing in a front or in certain fronts. In asymmetrical warfare, let's take the war of the West or certain elements of the West against Al-Qaeda or other elements. Let's take the Israeli case of fighting Hamas, to a certain degree Hezbollah as well. Hamas and Al-Qaeda do not distinguish themselves from their environment by wearing uniforms. They shoot indiscriminately at people on the other side, whether they have uniform or not. The idea of uniform has to be abolished. And also the aim of the war is that it shouldn't have a front. It should be actually a war of all against all and everywhere. So that's one very important asymmetry. I'm now not judging it, not evaluating it morally. Soon I'm going to come to the moral issues. But it's a feature of the war. It's an attempt by one side, for a variety of reasons, to erase the very idea of uniform and front from that struggle. There is another feature of asymmetry, which for me is educationally and morally very important, is that in asymmetrical warfare, usually, the clash, it's a micro war. By that I mean units clash, usually very small units. One party wants that the other party would not be able to bring to bear its superiority. So these are micro clashes between units. These are not big armored armies clashing in a front. That means, by the way, that the moral burden on the lower level of operations is immense. If I'm asking what was, let's take an Israeli soldier in the 73 war, in the Sinai Desert or in the Golan war, what were his moral questions facing the other side? It had to do with prisoners of war, looting, the conditions in which soldiers, let's say the larger moral issues discussed relevant in the war, bombing strategic targets, whether legitimate or not, are decisions made by 10 people altogether in the top command or in the political echelon. In the nature of the war as it unfolded since the 90s, a soldier, a simple soldier, in the so-called micro battlefield asymmetrical war, looks at the roof, he says, is that person up there a frightened civilian, a scout? Does he have a pipe in his hand or a rifle? He has to be engaged in ongoing moral decisions. The moral burden is immense. And what I want to do in short is reflect on these conditions. What does that mean? Where do we go from there? And I'm reflecting now on the party, on one party's obligation, not on the other party's obligation, though there are interesting things to say about that. Now, you take the way international law framed the rules of war. It framed them relative to symmetrical conflicts. So you have, for example, a very important principle, the principle of distinction. I think that's a basic moral and legal principle. You shoot or you target only combatants. Well, in symmetrical warfare, there is maybe not completely adequate definition, but you have a wholesale definition, which is everybody who has uniform, who wears uniform, by that fact, he or she belonged to the arm in the other side that poses the actual military threat to your soldiers or civilians. These people are targetable. But when the other side intentionally wants to eliminate the very concept of uniform, how you define a combatant? Who is a combatant? How do you manage to maintain the most humane principle of warfare, which is distinction? So that's one issue. And then you have to go from a wholesale definition, you would say, to a retail definition, in which you have to go case by case and ask yourself the following question. Is that person, is that agent, through its intentional actions, has made himself part of the actual causal chain that functionally produces the threat? But it's a very complicated exercise, very complex, how to apply that. By the way, my comments do not refer to the question of the ad bellum, to the question of the reasons to engage in a war, but the actual behavior of armies in war. But I want to come to the main issue, as far as my experience tells, and I think here international law leaves us with a great void, and we have to work from first principles concerning the morality of warfare. In asymmetrical warfare, given the fact that the other side intentionally establishes its positions among civilians, intentionally does not distinguish itself from its civilian environment, there will be a lot of collateral harm. Any target you're going to harm, even if this is a legitimate target, will cost in collateral harm to civilians. And here we come to what Michael Walzer and others term the principle of responsibility. By that we mean the following. The fact that there will be a collateral harm cannot constrain you from defending your own civilians. But on the other hand, you are responsible for the collateral harm you cause, which means that the only justification in these conditions of engaging in such a struggle is that you have done everything possible to minimize the collateral harm that you expect. That means selection of ammunition, time of action, early warning to the civilians. You can do many things to minimize collateral harm. But the main thing, and here is where my experience and here is where the shortcomings of international law are, is the question of risk assumption by combatants, by your own soldiers, to minimize collateral harm. Let me give you a few examples. This is a way, also a paradox in humanitarian interventions. Usually, home constituencies allow you to intervene as long as you don't lose soldiers. So American pilots, not NATO pilots, get orders to operate in Serbia by way of high-altitude bombings. Well, high-altitude bombings minimize the risks to the pilot, but on the other hand, they're not that accurate, and they will cause greater collateral harm. So what is exactly the height you expect your pilot to fly? A unit moves within, in asymmetrical warfare, within heavily populated area. It wants cover. It calls for cover. Well, how much cover? If you want to play it safe and use a lot of cover, air cover or power, artillery cover, you're going to harm a lot of civilians around. If you minimize it, you're risking your soldiers. You enter a home, combatants of the other side will plant themselves in civilians' homes. If you enter by foot, you're going to risk your soldiers. You're going to minimize the risk to the civilians. If you attack the home by air, you're going to save your soldiers but risk those civilians. The main issue is risk and the assumption of risk. Now, I think, and this is my own normative point of view, that soldiers have to assume risks in order to minimize collateral harm. And they have to assume it for two very important reasons. If you tell soldiers, do not risk yourselves, do everything to minimize collateral harm, but don't assume risk, basically you block invention. You tell them, you know, do everything as simple as you can. It's like telling an interrogator, you take that information from the other person whom you interrogate by all means possible. That means he wouldn't come with anything interesting, actually, to extract that information. There will be a connection between lack of professionalism and brutality. And there is another more important feature, which is that here is an asymmetry of a different sort, that that by assuming slight risk to your own soldiers, let's say asking for less cover, you really minimize a huge risk from the other side. There is an asymmetry here which is very important. So first of all, by the way, international law leaves us open-ended. It's too permissive here. Soldiers have to assume risk in order to minimize collateral harm. I want to come to my last comment here about the moral educational problem of the soldier in this condition. And it's really about the question of how to teach phronesis. This is a Greek problem. How to teach discretion, judgment. Soldiers have to make lots of moral decisions in the battlefield, and usually and rightfully they claim that this is causing paralysis. You mean, I was asked by soldiers, you mean that before I shoot, I have to ask necessity, distinction, responsibility, proportionality? This is paralysis. Well, it's the sort of problems that soldiers in a usual battlefield do not encounter. And the whole preparation, the moral preparation of forces has to be such to prepare them ahead of time, to create a muscle memory of these conditions, to simulate them, to prepare them to the sort of new moral reality that they are encountering. So what I've done is the following. I've pointed at least to, in a short way, because we're just opening a conversation, in a short way, in what way I think we ought to define asymmetrical war vis-a-vis the moral legal challenges that it raises. And I pointed to what I consider the two main issues where we are left in kind of in a vacuum vis-a-vis international law and norms of war. The one is the issue of risk. All large questions referring to collateral harm have to do with the question, are you willing to risk your soldiers in order to minimize collateral harm to civilians? It's a huge issue. By the way, operationally, it comes again and again all the time. And the second one is what I would call the moral betrayal of the soldier. Soldiers, by the way, are creatures that are always betrayed, morally speaking. They're called upon to sacrifice, to make the highest sacrifice they can, and they meet a very cynical reality, and what they do, and that's very harmful to their moral life, their moral horizon shrinks to one principle, which is defending your body. The rest, the hell with it. So the question is how to prepare for armies who are engaging in such a war, how to prepare the soldier to encounter such issues in which the moral burden put on the shoulders of this soldier is incommensurable to the sort of problems we have in asymmetrical warfare. I just want to say one thing about the ad bellum issue. in cases militaries and states, this is a political issue, engage in asymmetrical warfare, which, as I say, will involve immense amount of collateral harm. The responsibility to do as much as they can to avoid the war is greater than symmetrical warfare. I mean, to do everything political they can to avoid it. But that's another opening, another maybe opening to another aspect or dimension of this issue. So I wanted just to remark on what I believe is the nature of asymmetry and the sort of moral, educational issue it posits to fighting forces within that condition.
Thank you very much, Moshe. Elaine, the floor is yours.
I look forward to talking about some of the issues of asymmetry and conventional war that have been raised by Andrew and Moshe. But I am, as my title announces, going to be talking about asymmetry in nuclear war, and in part about the damage or injury to all things living, humans, plants, animals, sky, earth, but also to the damage to civic stature by the elimination of our capacity for self-defense or self-preservation, and additionally, the elimination of our right to mutual aid, our ability to defend one another. The right of self-preservation is often understood as a right underlying all other rights. Both Locke and Hobbes said we have a natural right of self-preservation. Locke said that's why we enter into social contract in the first place, to try and increase the chances of preserving ourselves. So a huge architecture, transnational architecture, national architecture, that eliminates the right of self-preservation seems to me deeply incompatible with governance itself. This is an image that many of you know by Alfred Eisenstadt, mother and child in Hiroshima in Japan in December 1945. It was, I believe, a Life magazine cover image, and you can see why it would be. It's very beautiful and it compels attention. It conjures up in the incredible weave of cloth in both the mother and children's clothing the kind of beauty of civilization and what it creates. The photograph is, of course, also not misleading but incomplete, because these two people happily are intact, whereas thousands of people were not intact. It's also misleading because of the small numbers involved. People in public health differentiate between our capacity for narrative compassion, which we're sort of good at, not completely good at, and our capacity for statistical compassion, which we're terrible at. And understanding the problems of war, nuclear war, but actually all wars, depends some kind of ability for statistical compassion. One other thing about this particular image is that, of course, it's an image of a target in the past. Looking at targets in the past is crucial. A colleague of mine at MIT talks about addressing a room full of students, 200 students, and talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and people looking a little bit blank. And then he asked, how many of you know what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And according to him, 4 people raised their hands. I still think they must have misunderstood his question, but nonetheless, it's a reminder that, of course, we need to talk about targets in the past, but we can't undo the injuries that happened in the past. The only injuries we can undo are targets of the future. And so I'm going to be talking about targets of the future, and they sound like hypothetical targets, but that doesn't mean they're on real targets. It only means that they're hypothetical by virtue of being future, whether that's 5 minutes from now or a year from now or a decade from now, not by being unreal. And I should have said, just to frame this, that the most recent research on nuclear winter shows that even if there's a small nuclear exchange, not 1% of the current arsenal, but 1/100th of 1%, 44 million people will die in the first 3 hours, and 1 billion people will die in the first month. This particular image is made by people in Nagasaki of the weapons that currently exist and that are ready to be used. And as you can see, the United States and Russia own almost all of them, 15,300 of the total 16,400. All the icons from the white out are owned either by Russia or the United States. And the makers, as a small print tells you, you have to multiply the icons by 5 because they couldn't fit them all on there. Weapons on alert have already decided upon targets. So we sometimes think that targets are remote rust accruing hypotheticals, but as the National Resource Defense Council points out, they are not an outline of possibilities. They are a directive of what weapons have to be assigned to a target. That is, if there's a target, there is an actual weapon assigned to it in advance. And that means, at least it meant until the Clinton administration, actually programming the longitude and latitude into our submarine missiles at the moment they left port. You may know that under the Clinton administration, we changed to open ocean targeting. Was that a result of the fact that government officials found it obscene to actually have the longitude and latitude of the world's cities built into our missiles? Or was it the result of our own outcries about it? No, it was the result of the fact that hackers are feared, rightly feared, within the military, and therefore at the chance that a hacker would launch one of these missiles meant that it was better to have the longitude and latitude of open ocean areas rather than cities. I'm, by the way, not at all making light of the possibility of hackers. Just as one example, our F-35, which is a 90% digitized plane, was hacked into, and in the year in which that happened, it was one of 18,000 hackings in the federal government. So it's a very serious problem, but a bigger problem is the architecture of nuclear weapons that we have. The vocabulary that we have for differentiating targets against civilians and targets against military, very important in conventional war. Here, the distinction somewhat disintegrates. Again, the National Resources Defense Council takes the example of using 5% of the United States missiles and says that, 3% of our arsenal, and concludes that if it's aimed at civilian targets, there would be 50 million deaths, and if it's at military targets, there would be 12 million deaths. That's an important difference, but it's not as though there aren't huge numbers of casualties. This particular image is from a recent Scottish report on the UK Trident, that is the UK submarine, and what happens if it were to use a missile against Moscow. The report was done in 2013. It's a hypothetical, but it's based on many citations by the UK government that they needed to renew their Trident submarines in order to have them ready to use against Moscow. This particular image shows the schools that would be in the circle of the target if it were if what was targeted was the defense ministry in Moscow. In each of the triangles you see is a school, and there's, for example, a school for the deaf down at 6 o'clock and a school for music right above the inner circle, and there's also kindergartens and a school of drama. You may know that Scotland's recent vote for secession was driven primarily, or in large part, one of the large motivations was the desire of Scotland to be free of nuclear weapons. The UK's total arsenal is housed in Scotland on the Clyde River on the west side. 46% of the population voted in favor of that separation. And as I say, that yes vote was driven by the desire to get them out of the Clyde River, with the thought that they would then pass a constitution that made nuclear weapons illegal. And they had studied this very carefully, as had people in England. The studies show that England had nowhere else to put them. The Scottish report makes the point that Moscow has a high percentage of the Eurasia, the continent of Eurasia skyscrapers. If one considers the multiple of people killed in this hypothetical attack, 50 million, and compares it to 9/11, the 3,000 people killed, I think that's a factor of 17,000. So if you imagine that in geographical space, if you imagine the footprint of the World Trade Towers in Manhattan and now multiply it by 17,000, you can see one of the things that was motivating the Scottish people to disarm. And the report also shows specific buildings. For example, 3 from the bottom on our left is a 34-story building, and on the right, 3 down or 4 down is a building that's 57 floors with 1,000 apartments. This particular image showed the hospitals in the blast area, and I think there are 8 or 9 hospitals indicated here. And it again underscores the point that nuclear weapons don't just eliminate the right of self-preservation, because there is no form of defense against it, with 1 or 2 very small exceptions that I can go into. But it also eliminates the right of mutual aid. The hospitals themselves will be targeted, and of course it will be very costly for medical people from other areas to come into this area. This is a country with 4 nuclear submarines. That is the total UK arsenal. In the United States, we have 14 Ohio-class submarines. Each of them has the equivalent of 4,000 Hiroshima blasts. That means each of them has the capacity to destroy a continent. The Earth has 7 continents. We have 14 Ohio-class submarines. Under the Bush administration, and considering under Obama, we have 12 new ones now being made, the first one scheduled to be completed in 2019, and the last one in 2035, so just in time for this year's freshman class to graduate. And by the way, our submarines have the smallest blast power of our air-based and land-based and sea-based missiles. This is a very different report done on a potential blast in Rotterdam, and it's imagining a very small nuclear weapon used by a terrorist, a 12-kiloton explosion, which is roughly the size of the Hiroshima blast. And this first image, and again, when we talk about terrorists using nuclear weapons, remember that the only reason this material is available to terrorists is because the states have erected this huge array, this huge architectural array of these missiles and made the materials ready for anyone to use. The nature, the design of a nuclear weapon enables a tiny number of people to kill millions of people. That's true whether it's a state leader or a rogue state or a terrorist or a high school hacker. This particular image is just showing the consequences of the blast power, which would, of course, kill many people on impact by crushing their organs. This next image shows the consequences of the fire. At its core, it would be 50 million degrees Celsius. And they estimate that in Rotterdam there would be 20,000 burn victims, 10,000 who would die immediately, and 10,000 who would have terrible burns. Strangely or surprisingly to me, it turns out that their country only has 100 burn beds. But I was less surprised when I then looked at Mass General website, in which Mass General said that, quote, it was one of 4 verified adult burn centers in New England, so one of 4, and they had a total of 5 beds, which they're hoping to increase to 8. Now, I have reluctance to show people who are burned, so I won't do it, but I just instead use 2 substitute ways of quickly conjuring up what this means. In ordinary rescue practice, there's something called the rule of 9s, which divides up the human body, adult or human, into multiples of 18 or 9s, and that enables the rescue worker to look at someone who's terribly burned and quickly estimate what percentage of the body is covered with 2nd and 3rd degree burns. And in a way, there's this is true of every rescue procedure, that it has shortcuts for carrying out actions. But I think this one is particularly suggestive because it registers the fact that it is very hard to look at somebody whose whole visage has been terribly burned, and therefore this kind of rule of nines enables people to be able to act, and there are different procedures for what to do if it's less than 15% or if it's greater than 40%. The other quick shorthand for understanding what it means for people to be burned is something that I heard a nurse lecturing on at the Hastings Center for Ethics, and that is a procedure called staying. Nurses who work in bad burn clinics have a very hard time being there for more than a few days. They pretty soon stop looking at the patient. They don't want to touch the patient. They stand at a distance from the patients because what they're seeing is very difficult to take. And so they undergo a training that is called staying, which helps them to learn to continue giving care even in that situation. Now, these are procedures. The rule of nine and staying are developed for cases where there's one person who's burned or four persons who's burned, and what we're talking about right now is thousands of people who are burned. The Red Cross said at the recent convention in Vienna on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons that the worldwide Red Cross, Red Crescent, et cetera, did not have enough facilities to help if even one city received a nuclear weapon. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, but this shows, again in Rotterdam, the radioactivity level and the large number of people who would die essentially from blood coming into their lungs and suffocating. This image shows the radioactive floodwaters. The scenario posited a bomb brought into the docks, and 43,000 people in Rotterdam live 1 to 2 meters below sea level and would therefore be affected by the radioactive water that would quickly travel. And then, of course, there would be many other deaths from fallout, and depending on the direction of the wind, the fallout in this case is going towards Utrecht. By the way, in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists recently, there's an article by Ted Post and Lynn Eden showing what would happen if an 800 kiloton weapon were exploded over Manhattan. And I chose not to initiate you to that information if you haven't yet read it, but you might want to read it. It's not an unrealistic scenario. The one we're looking at here is 13 kilotons, or 12 kilotons. That one is 800, and Russia has 700 missiles, warheads of that power, as do we. Anyway, this Rotterdam reports that that at least half of the entire Rotterdam area would have to be abandoned for a year, and parts of other cities evacuated, and concludes that Rotterdam, as we know it, would cease to exist. It also says that there is no way to prepare for it. There simply is no way to prepare for it. And like many countries around the world, they expressed disgust with the failure of the nuclear powers to disarm. And I think you probably know that the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is coming up for review this spring, requires in Article 6 that the nuclear countries disarm, which they've taken almost no steps towards doing. So the point of international law is to solve the problem of statistical compassion. It says it doesn't matter whether you like North Koreans or not. You're not allowed to do certain kinds of injuries. It doesn't matter what you think of Syrians, et cetera. It helps you by saying you don't need to make this judgment about your solution. And the problem is that international law isn't being followed. So, for example, in 1995, 78 countries went to their International Court of Justice and asked that nuclear weapons be declared illegal And that included Islamic countries like Qatar. It included countries that didn't yet have nuclear weapons, like North Korea and India. And they all made very eloquent arguments using Hague Conventions, Geneva Conventions, St. Petersburg, conventions on the environment, like the Rio Convention on the ozone layer and the Vienna Convention, and so forth. And here's what's crucial to know. The United States, in a joint statement of the Department of Defense and the Department of State, argued that having nuclear weapons, threatening to use nuclear weapons, using nuclear weapons, and using nuclear weapons first did not violate Hague, Geneva, St. Petersburg, the conventions on the environment, did not even violate genocide. They acknowledged that millions of people will die, but the intent would not have been to eliminate a particular race. And I think that a kind of shorthand for the fact that we've lost the capacity for self-preservation is the fact that there's widespread belief that once nuclear weapons are invented, they can't be eliminated, which is a somewhat preposterous claim. They can be eliminated. Some of you may know Bill Joy's article in Wired magazine in the year 2000 that worried about whether robots could ever carry out a revolution against us. And it sounds kind of science fiction-y and craze until he says the prototype is nuclear weapons because they can eliminate us, and we've convinced ourselves we can't eliminate them. So I'll just quickly point out the fact that they are easily eliminated, and I'll give evidence from the South and then from the North, and I know I'm running out of time, so I'll be just a few more minutes. This is an image of all the countries that have nuclear weapons-free zone treaties, and it's the Treaty of Perlindaba and the Treaty of Rarotonga, Treaty of Bangkok, et cetera, and it actually has caused countries that had preliminary work done for nuclear weapons to roll those programs back, South Africa, Algeria. This is an image just from Wiki showing in blue the nuclear-free zones and the weapon states, and you can see that it is a north-south problem. This next image is a study, again done in Scotland, on how long it would take them to disarm their own tridents. And they conclude that different stages of it would take different lengths of time. To disable the triggers would take hours. To get them back into port might take days. But the whole thing would take between 2 and 4 years. People in the US military who have looked at this timetable have judged it to be realistic. Of course, it's different in our own case because we have a much larger arsenal, but it's very doable compared to, say, solving the problem of global warming, which has to be done, but it's not clear what the path is, or eliminating war altogether. It's not clear exactly how you would do that. But this, it's very clear how you would do it. So I'll just end by saying that people often acknowledge that nuclear weapons are ungovernable in the sense that they're subject to accidents. That certainly makes them ungovernable. They acknowledge that they're ungovernable and that they could be appropriated by a terrorist or a rogue state. That makes them ungovernable. But I think they're ungovernable in a much deeper sense that I've only begun to hint at here, and that comes from the fact that they eliminate the capacity for self-preservation and mutual aid.
Thank you, Elaine. So,
Jim, can you take that down? Oh,
what I'd like to do to open the conversation is to start with an issue that's raised by Moshe's third type of asymmetry, namely asymmetry in which uniform and front are removed from the picture. And I just want to begin by asking a question about that that's connected in some sense, actually, both to Andrew and Elaine's comments, and I'd like to hear everyone's views on it, and then maybe perhaps the conversation can evolve naturally, and if it does, that would be great. So This motion has to do with the front component there. I want to ask about the uniform component as well, but let's start with the front. You know, Elaine's pictures of Hiroshima suggest that already in World War II, certainly, and really it goes back earlier than that in use of artillery and especially air attack, the front was already very much in motion, it seems to be, and even eliminated. Arguably, uniforms are eliminated as well insofar as Hiroshima and Nagasaki involved the knowing targeting. Intentional is a more complicated term, but the knowing targeting of very large numbers of civilians in at targets that were not, formally speaking, military targets. One could speak about the bombing of Dresden as well, or the firebombing of London. There are obviously a range of possible examples, and one go back even before that to the British innovations in Iraq and their use of civilian-oriented bombing. So the first question really to ask is whether it's meaningful to talk about front in this way, given that it's already sort of to some degree outside the picture. The second part of the same question has to do with uniforms. And here, Andrew made the trenchant comment that asymmetric warfare is a name we give to things that people who thought of things that we haven't thought of. The non-use of uniforms itself seems to be part of a military strategy. And presumably the viewpoint from that perspective of people whose military operations don't take place in uniform is, well, you're states and you have big armies, so naturally you've developed uniforms for your own complicated reasons. But we have no particular interest in that. We're not bound as international parties in some way. And we dispute the claim that there's something fundamental in the change away from uniforms. And presumably they also would object to the way that international law says that if you're at war with someone who wears a uniform, then they're already an unlawful combatant. That's a topic that we haven't really touched on, but one of the strange features of the most recent conflict, for example, the US Al-Qaeda conflict, is that by declaring the conflict a war, the United States created a situation where, according to it, everyone on the other side was immediately not merely a combatant, but an unlawful combatant. Whereas every combatant in uniform on the American side was a lawful combatant, again, under the international laws of war. So that's a sort of second issue that connects to the first. So maybe, Moshe, do you want to start on the front question or the uniform question, and then we can sort of let it develop?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. It's the idea of trying to erase fronts is not something that happened in the last 20 years. It's something that, let's say, in the Israeli experience, has been a dramatic feature of the nature of the conflict. But not only. I mean, there is still an idea, and it comes with uniformless bodies, that the aim of the war is to shift your population from fear to panic. By panic, I mean a fear that cannot be located anywhere, that it could be everyone and everywhere. But you're right. I mean, this has precedence. I'm not saying that this is something new in the world. I do take, I mean, my sentiment vis-a-vis my moral evaluation, and here I talked about the obligations of armies, state armies, being thrown into this condition. You ask me about the other side behavior. You say, well, they say you have the privilege of fighting with uniforms, of trying to target maybe only combatants. We don't have that privilege. And these are rules that are dedicated in order to, I would say, anchor your superiority. It's the rules of the powerful. And I must say, morally, I don't share that. I'm not saying that that's your position. I think there is something debased, and the most horrible thing any combatant can do is intentional harm of the innocent. And by innocent, I mean those who do not pose any direct threat to him, to his civilians, or to his soldiers. I would take it as a given. I don't think it's a construction only of the powerful. I think, and by the way, in terms of my own viewing of the other side's actions, I think they have damaged seriously their cause. politically and morally, by slaughtering civilians. So I would stand fast with the principle of distinction as something serious. I also think that there is a moral obligation of combatants to separate themselves from their civilian environment. I can see the force of it. I do believe that the other party has enough ways of effectively and dramatically harming legitimate targets. I think so. And I think this is a cop-out, a moral cop-out and a shame of saying, well, the principle of distinction is really just a principle dictated by those who can afford it in order to anchor their superiority. So both my moral and political evaluation of this is firm.
Does it affect your judgment on that, Moshe, that the U.S. more or less ignored that principle in the case of Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
It's horrible. I think it was a war crime. It was an attack. It was an intentional attack. It was a cowardly intentional attack on civilian population in order to safeguard your combatants. That's what it was. And it's not clear, I mean, the second bomb 3 days afterwards. This is the worst thing an army can do. This is the worst thing a state can do. So I don't mean, by the way, don't get me wrong, I don't think that those who actually were uniform hold on to the principle of distinction.
Yeah.
They do one thing, which is that they manage to separate themselves from their civilian population, whether vis-a-vis the other side. The history of warfare is full of those brutalities and cruelties of armies or states intentionally harming non-combatants on the other side as part of their war strategy. It includes, by the way, the bombing of Dresden, which I think was very problematic. And I would say one thing that I found is that when militaries tell you that this is the only way that they can actually win the war, that those constraints do not allow them to do what they ought to do and understandably protect their own civilians and population, I think that that's actually a way of really either manifesting a lack of combat IQ because they have enough means of performing their mission, or a brutality masked with necessity arguments. Yes.
Andrew?
I don't want this to come across as too terribly cynical, but it seems to me that my reading of military history would be one that would suggest that nations choose to respect the principle of distinction when they find it convenient to do so.
Sure.
And that in many respects, where we find ourselves today is where status quo powers find themselves today is wanting to restore a principled distinction that we ourselves have repeatedly and fundamentally discarded over and over again. Now, let us think broadly in terms of colonial wars, where imperial powers, pretty safe to say, I think, have never honored the principle of distinction, have viewed the people to be colonized as inferior beings and therefore disposable. You know, whether we're talking about American wars against the U.S. wars against the indigenous populations, British imperialists, French imperialists, and so on. And even in the last century, in great power wars, as soon as it was appeared to be expedient, to disregard the principles of the principle of distinction, sure, out it went. Again, to think about World War I and the war at sea. I mean, I think in the Anglo sphere, we're very conscious of these dirty, rotten Germans sinking the Lusitania and that kind of thing. But the distant blockade imposed by the Royal Navy against Germany had as its purpose to starve the Germans, implicitly making the German civilian population, rendering them into combatants. And then yes, transition to World War II, where certainly the Nazis, paved the way. But in World War II, belligerents on both sides categorically rejected the notion of a principle of distinction, with strategic bombing as the principal sort of expression of that. But let's not. It wasn't limited to world. I mean, look at American bombing in Korea, the American use of firepower in Vietnam, and it's only when the invention of precision-guided munitions that I referred to in my talk, that those weapons are fielded, that it's at that point that status quo powers emphasizing military power begin to say, oh my gosh, killing civilians is a terrible thing. When it's our side that has the precision-guided munitions, and it's the other side, the asymmetric side, that doesn't. And we're morally appalled that the other side won't adhere to the principle of distinction.
Yeah, Elaine, please.
Yeah, so just to agree with what's being said, the Swiss who count things have shown that the number of civilians has steadily risen from World War I to World War II to Korea. That is the proportion, the ratio of civilian to military to Vietnam, and that, of course, with nuclear war, it would be close to 100%. And just to sort of echo a point that's been made, there's articles that to me are important. I don't know if the others like them very much, by Charles Dunlap, a colonel in the Air Force, who's also a judge general advocate, who's done very interesting articles on asymmetric warfare. And prior to 9/11, he had written an article talking about the asymmetry of power between the United States and many other countries of the world, saying the only resources people had left to confront us were going to be ones that were outside the laws of war. And his point was not to say that we needed a new form of warfare, but that we had to maintain the rules of war even if our opponents weren't doing so.
Well, I mean, and that's the core of a response, right? I mean, we could stipulate, Andrew, to everything that you said. We could concede all of it as a factual matter, and nevertheless argue that as a matter of ethics, it's still wrong intentionally to target civilians. And that argument is not, formally speaking, weakened by conceding that it's a highly convenient argument to have come up with at this moment in time. I mean, I'm actually prepared to concede, I don't know if Moshe is, but I'm willing to concede that that is an account, in fact, that international law is born in a very complex political way, and that it includes status quo powers adopting laws that do serve their own interests. I'm willing to stipulate that, and then ask separately the normative moral question of whether it's morally acceptable to target civilians. And my guess, I might be wrong, but my guess is you share that ethical impulse,
sure,
notwithstanding your historical account of how we got here.
Yes. But
I think the underlying rage in your description is fueled by a moral evaluation, proper moral evaluation. You said, look, I look at the history of this conduct of status quo powers, and they're murderers. So now the question, what follows from them? Now, well, the other side can do it because they did it. Now everybody has to be accountable for that.
This is sort of well beyond my field, but I guess I'm sort of struggling with whether or not there exists in a practical sense, a way of reconciling the political imperative, which I think is what drives matters of behavior in wartime, reconciling that with the moral imperatives that we are referring to. And again, my own, I'm sorry, very pessimistic sort of outlook on the history of warfare is that I don't see much basis for optimism to bring about that reconciliation.
Elaine, on the optimism question, you gave an extremely pessimistic presentation with a very optimistic conclusion. Do you want to say more about not the question of whether in practical terms you could eliminate nuclear weapons, but rather what the political economy would look like where countries that following a strategic logic that Andrew's described would choose to voluntarily get rid of their nuclear weapons? The practical side, as it were, not the, where do we put the warheads and how long will it take, but what are the conditions, the global conditions, in which this occurs beyond a sudden acceptance of a moral argument, which Andrew gives us historical reason to be somewhat skeptical about.
It's odd to me that people generally assume that if the United States disarmed, that you'd still have the problem that no one else wanted to, since we've had this long period in which countries have pleaded with the smaller number of nuclear states that we had in the past to disarm. And I assume that, and by the way, Russia, of course, has often asked us to give up our presidential first use policy, and we've always declined. I think they would happily go along with a program that ruined them economically in an earlier moment, and will do so again. But is it that you doubt that, I mean, I can see that the one problem is that a small country that has a very small number of conventional weapons might think that if it retains nuclear weapons, that will be be an equalizer. Is that what you're particularly worried about? Yeah, I mean,
broadly speaking, that plus the regime insurance function, which is of great use to a country like North Korea, and which would potentially be of use to Iran. If you have a regime and you fear, credibly, that major world powers would like your regime to be gone altogether, one very good way of self-protection, probably the lowest cost form of self-protection, is to have a functional nuclear strategy. So that would just be one example.
And countries that have given up their nuclear weapons have not earned immunity by doing that. They've often been
right. I mean, Ukraine is also a very good example. I mean, they weren't Ukraine's nuclear weapons, but when Ukraine disarmed, it came with assurance. Might be too strong a word, but it was meant to be assurance from the United States that its sovereignty would be respected as a consequence, and of course it hasn't been, which is a significant message to other countries who might be interested in disarming, that even they weren't fully guarantees, but assurances possibly are not to be taken terribly seriously.
I just have to assume that countries like North Korea, that for so long asked that these be declared illegal, would welcome the chance to give them up as well.
But why, given that they didn't have them at the time?
Okay, well, just remember that, I mean, we should keep in mind, this doesn't change your question completely, but keep in mind the second image I showed with this huge array of United States weapons in Russia, and it's estimated that North Korea has between 1 and 10 nuclear weapons, and Iran has none, but yet the amount of mental space that consumes among all of us, or the amount of print space in the newspapers, is way out of proportion. Normally we do it without ever mentioning our own nuclear weapons. But it's not irrelevant to what you're saying, because I think the feeling that, well, we have to keep these because of Iran and North Korea is on some level just bred by the fact that we've erased our knowledge of our own weapons and are incredibly alert to and sensitive to this much smaller arsenal.
Andrew, do you want to say something about the strategic logic of,
again,
nuclear power?
Your presentation is so compelling, and the day one of those things gets used, the universal response will be, how the hell did we let this happen?
Right.
But in the interim, it seems to me that there are any number of governments, not any number, there's some number of governments that place a greater value on the possession and non-use of weapons than the prospect of averting the catastrophe that you described. And North Korea is an example, Pakistan is an example, State of Israel is an example, probably Great Britain and France, in the sense that, I think it's sort of a bogus argument, in the sense that the possession of nuclear weapons somehow qualifies you to be in the, you know, with the big guys.
Big player, yeah.
But nonetheless, I doubt that there is a single decision maker in any of those countries that would countenance the kind of catastrophe you described. But at the present moment, you know, to a person, their calculation is, well, in the near term, possessing but not using is worth it. And in order to come up with an argument for the elimination of these weapons, it seems to me you have to confront that point of view. I personally think that, moral considerations aside, but politically, we could and should get rid of our nuclear arsenal. And that my personal view would be that that would have zero negative effect on our national security. But it's not clear to me that you could sell that to the president of Pakistan or the prime minister of Israel and whatever he is of North Korea.
That's a good title. Moshe, do you want to weigh in on this question?
Well, I think this is a very compelling moral argument. Now is the structure of, can you get to a kind of international situation of disarmament without an agency ensuring reciprocity? These are the problematic structures, right? That it will be hard to imagine a country unilaterally under risk disarming itself from its nuclear capabilities without having the assurances that the other side is not exploiting it to get superiority over them. Now the question is, this is a kind of a Hobbesian structure. How do we create insurance of reciprocity, which then, by that nature, the moral compelling reason kicks in even stronger, right? It's that lack of that sovereign insurance, a sovereign body that can monopolize violence, enforce disarmament, that creates these conditions that even maybe some good-willing countries who have nuclear fear that moment because of potential lack of reciprocity. That's a serious
Well, I think
concern.
that's where, when Elaine was talking about the tongue-in-cheek sort of adherence to the NPT,
Right.
is dead on.
Right.
I mean, were the United States, as one of the two leading nuclear powers, to take seriously its obligation in that treaty to vigorously pursue disarmament, then that could have, arguably, some kind of a political and moral effect to provide some momentum. You know so much more about this than I do, but I mean, at the end of the Cold War, we had in round numbers 30,000 nuclear warfare. Now you gave us a number of 7,000.
Yeah.
So there has been a so-called build down, but it's not a build down that has been undertaken with any serious intention of fulfilling the requirements of the NPT. That would be the.
But here's just a question for Elaine. Would you apply this same structure in the condition of Cold War, or is this a post-Cold War moment? Vis-a-vis unilateral disarmament of, let's say, the United States. Could the United States unilaterally disarm itself in the conditions of the Cold War?
Yes, and I should say that I am generally assuming that when we disarm, then you bring other countries with with you on it. And I mean, Andrew's willing to have unilateral disarmament, and many people with a great deal of military experience have said the same thing. I don't make this big.
But would you have the same? I think Moshe's question, at least as I read, is assume you knew that the other side wasn't going to disarm.
Yeah.
Would you do it anyway?
I would, but I understand that that's harder to convince others of. And by the way, I don't think that I really accept the distinction between Cold War and post-Cold War, because of those 14 Ohio-class submarines, 8 were made after the opening of the Berlin Wall. They were made during the 90s. So these, and we're renewing them, and we're renewing the.
Yeah. I think, yeah. So can I ask a shift to a question of the discourse of asymmetry? Because I think it was working differently in all 3 of the presentations, and I just would sort of like to draw attention to that, and then we'll open it up to the general audience, if that's okay. So I heard, Andrew, you to be saying that asymmetry is basically an obfuscating piece of jargon, because it's really a question of advantage, and adversaries are always seeking after advantages.
People should use your microphones.
Well, that is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. Well, why don't we move a little bit closer to our microphones? I wish people would raise their hands and say, please speak more loudly, rather than registering angry protest, but fair enough. Of all the angry protests I've ever heard in the middle of an event, that was the most reasonable.
It was done in conditions of asymmetry.
Yeah, exactly. He didn't have a microphone. So I hear, Andrew, I heard you to be saying that this is an obfuscating piece of terminology. It's about advantage. Everyone seeks advantage all the time. That's the name of the game. Elaine, it's more complex in your account, but I heard you to be using at least the idea of asymmetry as a kind of moral tool, to say that there's something troubling about the fact that conflict under nuclear conditions is so profoundly asymmetric. I mean, this is more discussed at greater length elsewhere in your recent book, but you have a kind of small r Republican preference for combat closer to the one-on-one, closer to the ideal of the duel, in which the 2 parties are at hand and they can only use violence that the other side can use. And I know it's partly because you think they'll be less likely to use that kind of violence, but also I sometimes think that I hear in you the view that actually that's morally the only kind of violence that's permissible, not because it'll reduce violence overall, but just because there's something, I'm not sure, morally or aesthetically preferable about not taking advantage. Somehow that you find the idea of taking advantage in battle to be morally unappealing. And that seems to be an idea that's sort of present in background moral considerations. And Moshe, you weren't engaged in that particular form of the discourse, but I wonder what you think about that. I wonder whether you think that there's any moral or ethical weight to the question of advantage taking, or whether advantage taking is itself neutral, provided one adheres to the other moral points. Because I think one of the issues it's a little bit unspoken, but it's in the background of some of the rhetoric of justification for the use of non-traditional techniques, like non-state actor techniques, is somehow the idea that it's unfair in the world that one side would have more power than another side. This is often heard rhetorically. All techniques or other techniques are justified specifically because they're not just because of necessity, but specifically because of some idea, spoken or unspoken, that it's just not fair that one side would be able to have the opportunity to take advantage over another side. And maybe that's not a view that's out there, but I sort of sense that it is. Please, go ahead, Elaine.
Moshe objected to high-flying bombers that don't put themselves at risk, and which is a halfway point towards drones, which are a tiny step towards nuclear weapons. And so, I think that I understood you to be objecting very much to asymmetries of risk. Not asymmetries of power, but asymmetries of risk.
Very interesting. Yeah, that's a much better question. I wish I'd asked that one. That's a better one to take on, Moshe. That's good.
So, no, let me then clarify my thinking about it. I engage this question of asymmetry from a very particular perspective, which is, what are the moral concerns of soldiers and armies who are engaging in a struggle against an adversary that doesn't distinguish itself from its civilian environment? Okay? I'm not now engaging in moralizing about what they do, etc. I said there are two issues. One is risk, and the other one, what I would call the moral burden and preparation for such a moment vis-a-vis training and other things. Now, I don't think that there is any reason from a moral point of view to expect equality of risks on both sides. I don't think so. The troubling aspect of high-altitude bombing is not that the pilots don't take risk, but the fact that they don't take risk means more collateral harm to civilians. I mean, it's strategy 101 that you ambush, that you attack when the other side, when the sun is in the other side's eyes, etc., etc. I mean, there is nothing per se problematic with that. When avoiding risk means soldiers ought to avoid risk, and they would avoid risk. That's understandable. But when avoiding risk means enlarging collateral death of non-combatants, that's where the problem comes in. Now, it's not true about the use of drones. I mean, use of drones have other problems. We have to let's talk about that. But the risk avoidance of those who operate. But I just want to say one thing about the psychology of warfare. At least my experience is that drone operators are less happy trigger and more careful in the use of force because they're not under risk. The commander at the field being pressured and frightened would use much more extensively his firepower. So the issue is risk, morally speaking, is really about soldiers ought to avoid risk as much as they can per se. But when avoiding risk means enlarging collateral harm to innocent people, that's where they are engaging in a immoral action.
Elaine, I think you disagree, so say more, please.
I disagree somewhat, though I can see people have hand raised like Michael over there. But I'll just briefly say that I think there's a problem. I think there's a problem with not having risk in addition to the amount of collateral damage, and that is that that traditionally the soldier is testing the aversiveness of his actions. Since soldiers don't want to kill, they're having to override everything they've been taught in civilization from the beginning, and yet they have to do it. And yet, if they themselves are at risk, there's a kind of resistance, and it increases it makes it necessary that they have more reason to
avoid it.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't disagree with that. I think it's a serious argument. I think it plays in different ways to different directions, right? Because on the one hand, when soldiers would assume risk and have to risk themselves, then the country or themselves will avoid engaging in battle. On the other hand, when they are actually in risk, they tend to use much more force in order to protect themselves more than necessary. Psychologically, it's a very complicated moment in assessing what is it that's going to happen.
Andrew, do you want to weigh in here, or shall I go? Okay, Michael Sandel.
My question is about the topic of symmetry and asymmetry, and whether the category of symmetry helps us understand or capture some feature about just and unjust war that wouldn't otherwise appear. By otherwise, I mean in standard traditional debates about just and unjust war, or the ethics of war. So one way of putting this question would be to ask whether symmetry is a virtue, morally speaking, in warfare, and if so, symmetry of what kind? A second way of putting the question is, does the category of symmetry direct our attention to some important ethical feature about war that we would miss if we simply spoke in traditional terms about just war theory?
Elaine, if I'm not mistaken, you may think that symmetry is a virtue in warfare. And if so, would you speak more about that?
I do think that it's a virtue in warfare. And as you were talking, I was thinking of this statement that's made by Clausewitz that Lenin and others have liked, that it's always the most powerful country that's the most peace-loving, because current boundaries favor that country, current trade arrangements favor that country, current moral descriptions favor that country. And this is often cited as an explanation for why theorists who oppose war, who argue for peace, stop short of putting an absolute prohibition on going to war, because it may be that there's going to have to be a kind of extreme renegotiation of boundaries and moral descriptions. But I think that that description foregrounds the fact that what countries are aspiring to do is to reach some kind of symmetry in their relations with one another. Just as persons, just as we say, following Rawls, that justice involves symmetry in all our relations to each other. That's his definition of fairness. Something like that seems to hold true in the relation of states as well.
Moshe, I take it that you disagree.
No, I think there is lots of wisdom in this. I want to say something to Michael's question and then respond to Elaine. So, at least the way I define asymmetry is a very particular way in which there is one side who's abolishing the very idea of uniform, and you confront that other side. And what I wanted to say is that the international law norms do not properly deal with that condition, which is morally taxing, educationally, etc. And it's too permissive when it comes to the problem of risk-taking or avoiding risk from the point of view of the soldier when it comes to collateral harm of civilians. I think it's, well, it depends how we define asymmetry. But if this is a way of defining it, and it's just a way, you can call it schmasymmetry or whatever, it's relevant to open up a whole field of new questions for that form of engagement that raises new moral challenges. It's morally relevant. Now, I would say in the field of violence, and this comes to the discussion between us, in the field of violence, there will always be, and Rawls and others will agree, a great asymmetry between the state and each of its citizens. The whole peace, the whole idea of civilized well-being means that there is a sovereign that has a monopoly of violence to a degree that that sovereign can interfere in a cycle, ongoing cycle of revenge without becoming part of that cycle, because there is asymmetry between it and every other citizen. I think what you see around us in ways, if you look at the violence today, the collapse of that asymmetry in different countries is the Hobbesian hell of civil disorder. So there is a way in which, when it comes to power, we actually seek is asymmetry as a guardian of peace. Now, we ask ourselves, what about relationship between states? Should we have an equal distribution of power between states? And would that make things better? That would be very interesting. I think it could make things better only given an Hobbesian situation of somebody monopolizing power, disarming everybody, etc., etc. I would wonder what a word like that would look. I mean, the Hobbesian condition is exactly the condition of equality of threat, that each of us has equal potential to threaten one another. without our capacity to enforce reciprocity. So it will be a complex structure in terms of our thinking about asymmetry of power, and internal to the state, how essential it is to the very idea of ending civil strife and civil war, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just an added thought.
I want to add a footnote to that, but Andrew, I want to give you a chance to speak about it if you'd like.
Well, I'm a historian, so I'm so far out of my lane here that it's extraordinary. But if the question reduces to wouldn't somehow we be better off if belligerents or would-be belligerents related to one another in a condition of symmetry, it seems to me that that is imposing on war something that is contrary to the nature of war. In my title of my talk was trying to say asymmetry is to war as partisanship is to politics. I think it'd be great if we had nonpartisan politics, if Republicans and Democrats would get together and try to do what's right for the common good. It ain't going to happen. I mean, politics are partisan. And it seems to me that it is in the nature of war for belligerents or would-be belligerents to seek that asymmetric advantage, either during the course of the war or in anticipation of the war. And I just don't see any way around that.
So my footnote is just, Michael, which is relevant to your question, is it seems to me that notwithstanding my agreement with Andrew's description of the conditions of war, there seems to be an idea, it may be vestigial, I'm not sure it's vestigial, but a normative ideal of symmetry that nevertheless is sustained, notwithstanding the recognition that both sides are seeking advantage. And the duel, which I mentioned earlier, comes up as relevant in this context. Right? The duel imagined as an idealized form of warfare in which each side is given the identical weapon and under very strictly managed rules. And in a way, subsequent international legal efforts to regulate war try on various dimensions to recreate not the entirety but certain aspects of that condition. And I think probably that ideal comes out of a certain picture of honor, probably a certain picture of manhood. I imagine it's probably highly gendered. And perhaps one that's also connected to a conception of the 19th century conception of the nation state as embodying the honor and sovereignty of particular Westphalian monarchs. Now, I don't think that's ever corresponded to actual war. And I completely agree with Andrew to that degree. But I think it's somehow doing some work, nevertheless, in the background of our thinking. And I think it can be teased out at moments in these other accounts. Yes, please, Jane.
Thank you. This is an extremely interesting and important panel. I have an observation in response to this issue of asymmetry, and then a question for Moshe. In international humanitarian law, as the ICRC sees it, wars should be short and peace long. And all modes of law, including the restrictions on certain kinds of weapons, are oriented towards not leaving a burden of suffering and grief and revenge in the population that's been defeated. So I think in some terms, if you carry that forward, asymmetric war, in the sense that one is powerful and can bring it to a steady conclusion, is the optimum in IHL. And that's also one of the principles, that's used in bello, but also in use ad bello, one of the principles you actually have to advance is that you have the means to bring this war to a definitive conclusion. In other words, an asymmetric sense. So that's my contribution to this part of it. But Pace nuclear weapons, Elaine, you are most eloquent, and I applaud you for this. Moshe, I mean, I honor your perspective on the soldier. And I do believe that it is an extraordinary burden to have to make these decisions about who is a target and who is not in terms of legitimacy in IHL at the moment in the scrum without a whole lot of guidance. But I would say, and this is in part my work in human rights in conflict settings, but also most recently in my work in Gaza, where I was part of a team sent by PHR Israel, Physicians for Human Rights Israel, to look at the situation, that there is a question that actually lies on the level of leadership, which is at a certain point, whether you like it or not, or whether you think it's unlawful or not, you do have belligerents mixed in with vast numbers of civilians. They are inextricable from those civilians. And to use heavy armaments from, I mean, there was aerial bombardment, F-16s, drones, and barrel bombs by planes, heavy artillery. And when you wind up with a situation where a large section of Gaza is again pulverized, there have been 4 wars, we know, and 11,000 civilians casualties. I would say that at the leadership level, there has to be a calculus as to whether that context in Gaza is actually in any way a legitimate military target, and that there has to be another way to proceed rather than more bombing and more artillery. Thank you.
I think I said that in my response, my comments, I said that in cases in which, especially in this type of warfare, the knowledge of the expected collateral harm of your actions put on your political leadership an onus to try as much as they can to avoid it. You're absolutely right. Now, I'm not sure I want to go into the details of my own criticism of my own government on these issues. I think could have done a lot not to get to that point in terms of blockade, in terms of other issues, in terms of the negotiations with the other side, et cetera, et cetera. So I am in a lot of agreement with you on the assessment of that. Where I think I might differ, but that's a different issue of assessment, is you might find yourself in a situation where your obligation to defend your citizen will involve, given the constraints that the other side is put on you, will involve harming innocent people collaterally. And then you ask yourself, okay, what do I do now? Again, first of all, you have to try as much as you can politically not to get to that point, but you might get to that point. And then there are obligations on you to try to minimize that harm as much as you can. I said even risking forces and other things. Then you have to evaluate backwardly your own action and say, given this, have I done enough? Have I done enough to protect the civilian population? These are the sort of questions. I don't think that there is a kind of an a priori position of saying, well, you're gonna, the population is intertwined, it will involve harming innocent people in the other side, you're bound to do nothing. I don't think it's a possible, probable, moral claim on the other side. So I would agree with you that there is a lot to be done, especially in those situations, not to get into that type of conflict altogether. When you get into that conflict, there is a lot to be done in thinking how to minimize collateral harm. I'm not going to say that there is an a priori way in which you have to surrender given this condition and just allow the other side to attack your own population. That's the sort of dilemmas you have to work with.
Right. It would seem odd that if the conditions of symmetry would somehow require one not to win in a conflict. That seems odd. Homi, please.
This has been really extraordinarily interesting, partly because if you try to derive a set of rules for war on the basis of each of your presentations, I think it would be difficult. I think there'd be some overlap. It would be difficult actually to elaborate a program of, say, 6 issues coming out of the specific experiences, not a horizon issues, coming out of the specific experiences that you talk about. But there is an issue to do with asymmetry, a word that I think needs to be used in a whole range of ways, which is inequality. We talk about asymmetry, but again and again, each of you pointed to various inequalities. Inequalities of power, inequalities of authority. In Elaine's case, the North-South division as to who owns, who has the weapons, who doesn't. And I wonder whether there is something to be said about conditions of inequality and how they impact on asymmetric war. And this is not simply a question of the weapons of the weak. It's not simply a question of the weapons of the weak, but many of these important ideas of distinction, proportionality, and so on, depend in some way on what Noah said, that the ideal is the duel, 2 people looking on a level playing field. But I think inequality might be something, and it's of course a social condition, but also a political condition, that might allow us to think about issues somewhat outside the battlefield, whatever that field is. Maybe the field doesn't exist, it's a virtual field, and the way in which inequalities enter as kind of moral justifications into the construction of asymmetric war.
Yeah, it seems to me that countries like the United States, arguably Israel, that are most, that struggle most with the challenges posed by what we are calling asymmetric war, asymmetric challenges, are in fact countries that politically enjoy positions of inequality. I mean, the West generally, the United States in particular, has come to enjoy a privileged position in the international order that benefits all of us, politically, economically, and the like. And asymmetric military challenges that pose a threat, let us say very broadly speaking here now, radical Islam, and that employ asymmetric military techniques, elicit these strong objections, an insistence that no, wars need to adhere to certain rules. So I do think that in some sense a nation's perspective on these matters within war of symmetry and asymmetry stem from a larger political set of political purposes, and the two mesh, if that's what you were getting at.
Yeah, I'm trying to open that question from each perspective.
I think that there's a sort of emerging normative idea that we should strive to equality of force, that the inequality of force between parties as such is a wrong. I mean, I think this is the position of those who are against gun control in this country, right, vis-a-vis the government. They want to achieve a certain type of autonomy of use of force. Now, I'm not sure that whatever ideas that we have about equality, the equal right to use the same amount of violence vis-a-vis the other, establishing this moral right, I find puzzling as such. No, I'm I'm not saying that this is your point. I'm just saying, what is it that we think about the conditions of asymmetry in terms of the use of power? Now, we have a prior moral evaluation, which is very complicated in the use of force. You do want the aggressor to have less power than the defender. You do wish for a condition in which those who engage in war of genuine self-defense will have more power than the other side. So I think that the idea of equality of violence per se as a moral organizing category of justice, in that respect is puzzling. Because we have to assess it on prior moral conditions. You do want the Allies to have more power than the Nazis, given the aims of the war, given the nature of the conflict. So it will be strange to you want the police to have more force than every criminal around. So it will be strange to posit a concept of symmetry of force as a moral principle per se, disassociating it from the larger context of aggressor, defender, aims of war, conditions of war, etc., etc. There are countries that are in a position in which, if the case will be such that they're not going to have more force, their life will be more miserable. It will look like the very fabric of their condition of living will not be there. So I would raise that issue as something that might come out of this conversation.
And in the case of nuclear weapons, though you can talk about countries with different arsenals facing each other, what I was mainly talking about was the small number of people of whatever country that oppose the world's population of animals, birds, humans, etc. And again, the Swiss have a useful term they keep using, the equality of survival. Everyone has to have an equal equality of survival, and it's why their country requires every house to have a fallout shelter, and why inside every mountain or inside many mountains are invisible hospitals preparing for a kind of catastrophe. But maybe a kind of version of this that's more convincing, although that one's very convincing to me, is the basis of Hobbes' belief in equality. And Hobbes' whole idea of social contract existed to ensure peace. And he's been very distorted in the nuclear age. But his belief that we all are equal is based on our equality of injurability, the fact that we can all be killed by one another, and even a large person can be killed by a small person, etc. It's not the most romantic notion of the basis of equality, but it was his starting point, and led to what Richard Tuck and others have seen as a kind of radical democracy.
This symposium has 3 parts. We've now reached the conclusion of the first. In a moment, I'll officially thank the panelists and ask for your applause. But I want to tell you that the second part, which will be a keynote lecture by Professor Jeremy Waldron, begins at 5 o'clock. And then at 6:45 will be our final panel. Now, given the intensity of the subject matter and the length of the event, do not think that the Humanities Center does not have a deep interest in your well-being. It does. It wants to ensure your quality of survivability, much like Switzerland. And so, in lieu of a fallout shelter, in room 136 to the left, there will be refreshments available now until the beginning of Professor Waldron's lecture at 5 o'clock. And I invite and urge you all to join us there, and I hope you will join me in thanking the panelists for a wonderful exchange.